Was he a fraud who stumbled upon immortality, or did he genuinely possess a key to unlock the future? More importantly, why has humanity, for nearly 500 years, refused to let go of the cryptic verses penned by Michel de Nostradamus, a 16th-century physician who failed, by his own admission, to save the people closest to him from death? His story begins not with visions of falling stars or collapsing kingdoms, but with the stench of decomposition and the sound of funeral bells. In the year 1537, the plague, that relentless shadow stretching across Europe, descended upon the world of Dr. Nostradamus with intimate cruelty. He was a man of science in an age of superstition, a graduate of the prestigious University of Montpellier, lauded for his innovative treatments against the Black Death. He advocated for hygiene, for fresh air, for unpolluted water, and for herbal remedies based on rose hips rich in vitamin C. He refused to bleed his patients, a common practice that often hastened death. In towns like Aix-en-Provence and Lyon, he became a hero, a miracle worker who walked through infected quarters while other physicians fled. Yet, when the pestilence reached his own doorstep in Agen, his skills proved utterly useless. His wife, Henriette d'Ancos, and his 2 young children, a son and a daughter, succumbed rapidly to the disease. The loss shattered him. The community that once celebrated him turned suspicious. A doctor who cannot save his own family is either incompetent or cursed. Accusations followed, not just of medical failure, but of something darker. The failure to protect his family marked a profound turning point. It was the moment the rationalist began to crack, allowing the mystic to emerge from the fissures of grief. The world of empirical observation had betrayed him. He could measure herbs and diagnose symptoms, but he could not prevent fate. This existential crisis pushed him away from traditional medicine and toward the forbidden arts. For nearly a decade, he became a wanderer, a man without anchor, traveling through France, Italy, and possibly Sicily. He sought out alchemists, Kabbalists, and astrologers, absorbing the esoteric knowledge that defined the Renaissance underground. The Inquisition, ever watchful for heresy, took note of his changing interests and his increasingly unorthodox statements. A careless remark about a statue of the Virgin Mary nearly led to his arrest in Agen, forcing him to flee once more. This period of wandering was not merely an escape, it was an incubation. He was shedding the skin of the physician and cultivating the persona of the seer. The fear he experienced during these years, fear of the plague, fear of the church, fear of his own powerlessness, would become the raw material for his future work. He learned that in an age defined by catastrophic uncertainty, people crave not cures for the present, but assurances about the future. His resettlement in Salon de Provence in the year 1547 marked the beginning of his second life. He remarried a wealthy widow, Anne Ponsard, established a successful practice, and regained a semblance of respectability. However, by night, his true work commenced. In a secluded study at the top of his house, he began compiling his first almanacs. These were popular publications, common at the time, offering predictions for weather patterns, harvests, and general guidance for the coming year. They were a mixture of practical agriculture advice and vague astrological forecasts. Crucially, they allowed him to test the waters, to hone his craft of ambiguity. He learned to write sentences that felt specific, yet could be interpreted in multiple ways. The success of the almanacs was immediate. Farmers, merchants, and minor nobles began to seek his counsel. He was no longer just a plague doctor, he was becoming an oracle. Yet the almanacs were merely a prelude, a rehearsal for the masterpiece of dread he was constructing in secret. He was beginning to draft the quatrains, the 4-line verses that would eventually form his centuries. These were different from the agricultural predictions. They spoke of fire, war, dethroned kings and empires rising from dust. The France of King Henry II was a tinderbox awaiting a spark. Religious tensions between Catholics and the rising Protestant Huguenots were cleaving the nation apart. The Valois dynasty, while powerful, felt increasingly precarious. The air crackled with prophecies and portents. Into this volatile environment, Nostradamus prepared to unleash his work. in 1555, he published the first edition of Les Prophéties, containing the initial 353 quatrains. The reaction was explosive. Unlike the reassuring vagueness of his almanacs, these verses were dark, apocalyptic, and deeply unsettling. He wrote of songs, chants, and demands from the enslaved populace, interpreted later as premonitions of revolution. He wrote of great fires and floods, but most dangerously, he wrote in coded language about the fate of the ruling elite. The book was a sensation, debated in taverns and scrutinized in the halls of power. Some dismissed him as a charlatan capitalizing on fear, others saw him as a genuine conduit for divine warning. The ambiguity that protected him from charges of heresy also fueled his fame. He had learned that a prophecy which demands interpretation involves the reader in the act of creation, making them complicit in the vision. The core of his early work was steeped in the trauma he had witnessed. Having seen society crumble under the weight of disease, he understood that human civilization was a fragile veneer. His predictions were not truly about specific future events, but about the cyclical nature of human self-destruction. He projected the anxieties of the 16th century, plague, famine, religious fanaticism, and sudden death onto the canvas of eternity. He recognized that fear is timeless. A ruler in any century worries about assassination. A society in any century fears collapse. His genius was in codifying these universal anxieties into a language that felt both ancient and perpetually relevant. He created a system where failure was impossible. If a prophecy did not come true, it was merely because it had not happened yet, or because it had been misinterpreted. The physician had learned that while medicine could fail the body, mysticism offered an infallible solace for the mind. Kings and queens, despite their immense power, were perhaps the most fearful of all, for they had the most to lose. The rumors of this strange book, filled with dark portents for rulers, soon reached the ears of the most powerful and superstitious woman in France, Queen Catherine de Medici. The summons arrived like a death warrant a year after the publication of his book. When Michel de Nostradamus received the call to appear before King Henry II and Queen Catherine de Medici in Paris in 1005-156, he must have understood the razor-thin line he walked. He was traveling toward the epicenter of power, a place where fortunes were made and traitors were dismembered with equal efficiency. For a man accused of witchcraft in the provinces, a royal audience could mean one of two things: unparalleled patronage or the executioner's block. The journey from Salon de Provence to Paris was arduous, but the true trial awaited within the Louvre Palace. Catherine de Medici was not merely curious, she was desperate. Italian by birth, steeped in the occult traditions of Florence, she ruled a kingdom increasingly divided by religious hatred, and she bore the burden of ensuring the survival of the Valois line through her frail and numerous children. She collected seers, astrologers, and magicians, constantly seeking reassurance against the backdrop of political instability. Nostradamus, with his terrifyingly specific yet frustratingly vague quatrains, represented either the ultimate threat or the ultimate tool. He was immediately subjected to intense interrogation by royal advisors and theologians who scrutinized his methods and his faith. Nostradamus's survival strategy at court was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and calculated ambiguity. He understood that to give a clear, verifiable prediction was to invite failure. Instead, he offered riddles wrapped in celestial jargon. When questioned directly about the fate of the royal family, he would speak of constellations, historical cycles, and divine will, carefully avoiding specifics unless absolutely necessary. He presented himself not as a sorcerer bending reality, but as a humble interpreter of divine patterns, a conduit for warnings that could perhaps be heeded to alter destiny. This approach appealed directly to Catherine's own sense of agency. She did not want to hear an unchangeable fate, she wanted information she could use. He famously examined her children, including the future kings Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, as well as the young Marguerite de Valois. Legends, likely embellished later, claim he whispered to Catherine that all her sons would wear crowns, a prophecy that technically came true, though he omitted the fact that their reigns would be short, bloody, and ultimately led to the extinction of their dynasty. He told the Queen what she needed to hear, carefully packaged within layers of foreboding that kept her reliant upon him for further interpretation. The court itself was a viper's nest, a battleground for influence between the powerful Catholic faction led by the Guise family and the rising Protestant Huguenots. Nostradamus had to navigate this minefield with extreme caution. His prophecies were already being weaponized. Catholics might interpret a quatrain predicting fire and ruin as divine judgment against heretics, while Huguenots might see the same verse as predicting the fall of a corrupt Catholic monarchy. Nostradamus himself maintained a carefully neutral public stance, focusing his loyalty entirely on the crown. He knew that if either faction believed he actively favored the other, his life would be forfeit. His verses became a shared language of anxiety at court. Courtiers would whisper interpretations of quatrains in shadowed alcoves, each projecting their hopes and fears onto his text. He became less a person and more a phenomenon, a living symbol of the kingdom's precarious future. This era cemented one of the key aphorisms of his legacy. Kings feared his predictions, but they feared even more that the predictions would fall into the hands of their enemies. Perhaps the most enduring legend from this period involves Nostradamus and a magic mirror, an event popularized in later accounts, though absent from contemporary records. The story goes that Catherine, desperate to know the lineage of her sons, demanded Nostradamus show her the future. In a darkened room, using a technique involving angelic invocation or scrying, he supposedly conjured images in a mirror. An angel appeared, and for each future king, the angel turned a crank a certain number of times, indicating the years of their reign. For Francis II, 1 turn. For Charles IX, 14 turns. For Henry III, 15 turns. Then, for Henry of Navarre, who would succeed them and found the Bourbon dynasty, 22 turns. The vision, according to the legend, left Catherine terrified, as it confirmed the end of her bloodline's direct rule. While almost certainly apocryphal, this story illustrates the potent role Nostradamus came to occupy in the royal imagination. He was the possessor of forbidden knowledge, capable of revealing the machinery of fate itself. The relationship between Catherine and Nostradamus was symbiotic. She provided him with protection from the Inquisition and substantial financial rewards, appointing him physician in ordinary to the court. He, in turn, provided her with a sense of control, or at least preparedness, in an uncontrollable world. He validated her anxieties while simultaneously offering a potential path through them via his counsel. This relationship highlights a fundamental truth about power and prophecy. Those with the most to lose are often the most susceptible to those claiming to see the future. The certainty of power in the present breeds an intense fear of uncertainty in the future. Catherine de Medici, one of the most ruthless and politically astute rulers of the 16th century, found herself dependent on the coded warnings of a provincial doctor because he offered something politics could not, a narrative for the chaos. She encouraged him to continue his work, effectively giving royal sanction to the publication of the subsequent parts of his centuries. This patronage allowed Nostradamus to return to Salon de Provence not as a suspect, but as a triumphant figure, shielded by royal favor. He spent the remaining years of his life expanding his magnum opus, secure in the knowledge that his legacy was protected, for now, by the very power structures he so often warned against. However, the true test of his fame was yet to come. His relationship with the Queen was built on suggestion and potential, on warnings of future calamities for her children. But hidden within the pages he had already published, before he even met the Queen, lay a specific verse. It was a quatrain that was precise, visceral, and aimed not at the next generation but directly at the reigning King Henry II. It described a gruesome, specific death, and it was waiting patiently for history to catch up. The true measure of Nostradamus's power would not be decided by intricate court maneuvers or astrological charts, but by the splintering of a lance on a tournament field. The transition from intellectual curiosity to genuine terror was imminent. The question of how Nostradamus created his centuries remains one of history's most compelling intellectual mysteries. When he returned from the royal court to the relative quiet of Salon de Provence, he intensified his work in the small study at the top of his house, a room that has since become a shrine for believers and a subject of intense scrutiny for historians. What truly transpired in that room during the late hours between 1555 and his death in 1566? The popular image, cultivated by sensationalists, depicts a wizard hunched over a bubbling cauldron, inhaling hallucinogenic fumes and receiving divine visions. Nostradamus himself contributed to this mystique. In the preface to his son Caesar, he describes elaborate nocturnal rituals involving a brass tripod and specific calculations, borrowing heavily from classical descriptions of oracles like the one at Delphi. He claimed to use poetic furor, a state of divine inspiration, to access these future events. However, a closer examination of his methods reveals less sorcery and more scholarship. Nostradamus was a product of the Renaissance, a period where science and mysticism were not yet fully divorced. His laboratory was less about magic and more about a synthesis of available knowledge. His primary method was historical projection. Nostradamus was an erudite scholar with an extensive library. He possessed deep knowledge of classical authors, particularly Titus Livy, Plutarch, and Suetonius, as well as various compilations of ancient prophecies and biblical texts. He operated on the principle that history is cyclical. He believed that patterns of war, famine, plague, and political upheaval repeat themselves. To predict the future, he studied the past. He would find a historical event, for example, the rise of a dictator in ancient Rome, or a persecution campaign described by Herodotus, and then transpose its core elements onto a future European setting. He would deliberately obscure the details, removing specific names and dates, replacing them with astrological alignments or allegorical figures. This method ensured that his predictions were almost guaranteed to resonate eventually. A prophecy about a tyrant rising in the west or a great fire consuming a city would find its match sooner or later, simply because tyrants and fires are recurring features of human history. The prophecy was often just history repurposed as prediction. The linguistic construction of the quatrains is central to his enduring success and demonstrates his true genius, calculated obfuscation. Nostradamus did not write in clear, contemporary French. He crafted a unique, almost impenetrable linguistic brew. The verses are a mixture of 16th century French, Latin, Provençal dialect, classical Greek, and even self-invented words. He employed complex syntax, anagrams, and metaphors that could be interpreted in dozens of different ways. Was this obscurity a result of divine inspiration rendering human language inadequate, or was it a deliberate strategy for self-preservation? The answer is almost certainly the latter. Living under the constant threat of the Inquisition, making direct predictions against the church or royalty was potentially fatal. By couching his predictions in dense allegory and multiple languages, he created plausible deniability. If accused of heresy or treason, he could simply argue that the interpreters had misunderstood his complex poetic meaning. This ambiguity was his shield. It allowed him to make terrifying claims while remaining just beyond the reach of the executioner. Furthermore, astrology provided the framework and justification for his work. In the 16th century, astrology was considered a legitimate science, taught in universities and employed by royalty. Nostradamus used complex astrological calculations to date his predictions, often referring to conjunctions of planets or specific celestial events. This lent his work an air of scientific authority. However, modern analysis of these astrological references reveals inconsistencies and errors. It appears he used astrology less as a precise tool for timing events and more as another layer of cryptographic complexity. The astronomical data served to anchor the vague prophecies in something that looked like empirical evidence, satisfying the intellectual demands of his era while further confusing any potential critic attempting to definitively prove a prediction false. He was, in essence, creating a text that was future-proof. Its very incoherence ensured its longevity, as each generation could reproject its own crises onto the blank slate he provided. The psychological pressure under which he worked must have been immense. He was balancing fame with fear. While in Ceylon, he suffered from gout and edema, conditions that progressively worsened. There is a palpable sense of urgency in his later writings, a race against time to complete his magnum opus before death claimed him. He referred to his work as a prophecy for all time, extending thousands of years into the future. This suggests an enormous ambition, a desire to transcend his identity as a plague doctor and secure a form of immortality through his words. He was not just chronicling the future, he was attempting to become a permanent fixture of it. This drive, born perhaps from the trauma of losing his first family, pushed him to work relentlessly, often in isolation. The image of the solitary scholar surrounded by ancient texts and star charts battling physical illness to encode the destiny of humanity is far more compelling and likely more accurate than the image of the supernatural mystic. He toiled in this manner, producing hundreds more quatrains, solidifying his reputation among Europe's elite. He was engaged in a high-wire act, leveraging ambiguity to build a legend. But legends require sacrifice, and a prophet's reputation requires validation in blood. While his broader predictions about general strife were easily accepted, one specific verse stood out for its chilling precision. It was quatrain 35 from his first century, published in 1555. It spoke of lions, golden cages, and a gruesome death. At the time of its publication, it was just another cryptic verse among many. But in the year 1559, 4 years after its publication and 3 years after his meeting with the Queen, King Henry II would stage a magnificent tournament in Paris. The festival would provide the stage, the actors, and the very specific golden cage mentioned in the text. The obscure verse was about to become the single most famous and fatal prediction in Renaissance history. The occasion for the celebration in June of 1559 was twofold: a peace treaty with the Habsburgs of Spain, ending decades of war, and the marriage of King Henry II's daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, to King Philip II of Spain. Paris was alive with festivity, and the highlight was a grand tournament held near the Place des Vosges. King Henry II, a robust and athletic man of 40, relished opportunities to display his chivalric prowess. Despite warnings from advisors and, legend claims, from Queen Catherine herself, who felt a growing unease, the king insisted on participating in the jousts. He successfully competed against several opponents throughout the day. As evening approached, he decided to ride one final time against the young Count of Montgomery, Gabriel de Lorges, captain of his Scottish Guard. It was a decision that would change the course of French history and catapult Nostradamus from court curiosity to figure of genuine dread. The stage was set for the collision of prophecy and reality, and the text in question was quatrain 35 from the 1st century. The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in a single duel. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, 2 wounds made one, then he dies a cruel death. The duel commenced. The 2 combatants charged, lances aimed. Both men wore helmets with gilded visors, the golden cages of the verse. Their lances struck simultaneously. Montgomery's lance, however, shattered upon impact with the king's shield. A large splinter from the shaft flew upward, finding purchase in the narrow slit of Henry's visor. The wooden shard penetrated the king's right eye and brow, driving deep into his brain. The force of the impact created multiple wounds. 2 wounds made one, as the quatrain chillingly described. Henry reeled in the saddle, mortally wounded but not instantly killed. He was carried from the tournament field, past a horrified court, to the Château de Tournelle. The finest surgeons in Europe, including the renowned Andreas Vesalius, were summoned to his bedside. They attempted desperate measures, even replicating the injury, on the severed heads of executed criminals to determine the exact path of the wound and potential treatments. But infection set in. For 10 agonizing days, the king suffered immensely, enduring fever, partial paralysis, and excruciating pain before finally succumbing to his injuries on July 10th, 1559. The festive city plunged into mourning. The impact of this event on Nostradamus' reputation cannot be overstated. Suddenly, the ambiguity vanished. The elements aligned with terrifying precision: the older lion, Henry, versus the younger lion, Montgomery, whose emblem featured a lion. The field of combat, the golden cage, the gilded visor, the wound to the eye, and the cruel death. Panic swept through the court. The prophecy was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was seen as a documented, fulfilled sentence of death. Queen Catherine de Medici, now a widow and regent for her young son Francis II, reportedly summoned Nostradamus again, this time not with skepticism, but with absolute conviction and terror. He had proven his power in the most horrific way possible. From that moment forward, the centuries were no longer considered mere poetic exercises or general warnings. They were viewed as an infallible roadmap to disaster. The book became essential reading for anyone trying to understand the unfolding chaos of the French wars of religion that followed Henry's death. Nostradamus himself was both vindicated and endangered. He had achieved the ultimate prophetic success, but success brought a new level of scrutiny and fear. Skeptics, both contemporary and modern, argue forcefully against the supernatural interpretation of this event. They point out that jousting accidents, while not common, were a known risk of the sport. Serious eye and face injuries had happened before. The term lion was a common heraldic symbol used by many noble families, not just Henry and Montgomery. The golden cage is a poetic yet reasonably accurate description of an ornate helmet visor. Furthermore, critics argue that the prophecy only gained its fame after the event. It is the classic example of post-diction or retrofitting, sifting through hundreds of vague verses to find the one that most closely matches the tragedy that has already occurred. Had the king died by poisoning, interpreters would have surely found a different quatrain about hidden venoms and banquets to champion as proof. The human brain excels at finding patterns in randomness, especially during times of trauma. The shock of the king's sudden, bizarre death created an intense psychological need for an explanation, and Nostradamus's verse provided a pre-made narrative that was far more satisfying than a random accident occurred. Regardless of whether it was coincidence or clairvoyance, the perception of truth became the new reality. The death of Henry II transformed Nostradamus from a prophet into the prophet. His legacy was cemented. He spent his final years as the most revered and feared man in France, continuing his work until his own death in 1566, a death he also allegedly predicted. He told his secretary on the eve of July 1st that he would not be found alive at sunrise. He died of complications from gout and edema during the night. The legend was now complete. However, the true life of his prophecies was only just beginning. For over 2 centuries, his book would remain a fixture of occult libraries, occasionally referenced but largely dormant as the Age of Enlightenment prioritized reason over mysticism. It awaited a new catalyst, a societal explosion of unparalleled violence, to resurrect its power on a national scale. The book that had foretold the death of one king would lie in wait, ready to justify the execution of another during the blood-soaked chaos of the French Revolution. What do you think defines a prophecy's power, the moment it is written, or the moment a believer decides it has come true? Consider whether a prediction has any authority before it's validated by tragedy. Let us know your thoughts. Choose fate if you believe the verse sealed the king's destiny, or choose coincidence if you think it was a lucky guess, amplified by panic. For nearly 200 years following Nostradamus' death, his centuries drifted through the currents of European intellectual life, largely relegated to the fringes. The Age of Enlightenment championed reason, logic, and scientific inquiry, pushing figures like Nostradamus into the realm of quaint superstition. Voltaire, the era's chief satirist, mocked the very idea of prophecy, dismissing the obscure quatrains as nonsensical gibberish designed to fool the credulous. The educated elite preferred the clockwork universe of Newton to the chaotic visions of the salon seer. The centuries gathered dust in libraries, a relic of a bygone era's anxieties. However, the Enlightenment's ideals of liberty and reason, when put into practice, paradoxically unleashed a period of profound chaos, violence, and societal collapse, the French Revolution. As the foundations of the old world crumbled, as terror gripped the streets of Paris, and as the guillotine became the symbol of progress, people desperately sought a framework to understand the escalating madness. Reason had failed to provide order, so society turned back to mysticism. The forgotten book of Nostradamus was about to experience a dramatic resurrection, becoming not just relevant but a potent ideological weapon. The catalyst for this revival was the sudden, dramatic fall of the monarchy. As revolutionaries sought to dismantle the Ancien Régime, they also sought historical justification for their actions. In the chaotic intellectual environment of revolutionary Paris, pamphlets and broadsheets became the primary mode of communication and propaganda. Enterprising printers and radical journalists rediscovered Nostradamus. They began combing through the nearly 1,000 quatrains, searching for verses that could be interpreted as foretelling the events unfolding around them. They found a wealth of material. Quatrains speaking of a great change in the realm, of decapitated people, and of a flight by a monarch were seized upon with fervor. The vagueness that once protected Nostradamus from the Inquisition now made his work perfectly adaptable to the needs of revolutionary propaganda. A verse about a vile-born group taking power could be interpreted as the rise of the common people through the Jacobin clubs. A mention of temples profaned was seen as a direct prediction of the de-Christianization campaign and the establishment of the cult of reason. One prophecy in particular became a cornerstone of revolutionary law: the prediction of the royal family's flight to Varennes in 1791. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, disguised, attempted to escape Paris but were captured in the small town of Varennes. Prophecy mongers immediately pointed to quatrains that mentioned a journey by night and a capture near a forest or river, twisting geographical details to fit Varennes. These interpretations spread like wildfire. They served a crucial psychological purpose. They suggested that the revolution was not an accident or a chaotic mess, but a preordained historical necessity. If Nostradamus had seen it 2 centuries earlier, then the actions of the revolutionaries were legitimized by fate itself. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 was framed as the fulfillment of a long prophesied downfall of tyranny. Nostradamus, once a court favorite of Catherine de Medici, was posthumously rebranded as a prophet of republicanism. However, the power of Nostradamus's ambiguity meant that he could not be monopolized by one side. Royalists, loyal to the deposed monarchy and horrified by the reign of terror, conducted their own interpretations. They found quatrains predicting the rise of bloodthirsty men, the martyrdom of the king, and the eventual restoration of order. For them, Nostradamus confirmed that the revolution was a temporary, demonic aberration and that divine justice would eventually prevail. This created a war of interpretations waged in print. The same book lay on the desks of radical revolutionaries like Maximilien Robespierre and exiled aristocrats. Each side read the exact same verses and saw a completely different future, one that confirmed their own righteousness and the inevitable doom of their enemies. The centuries became less a source of guidance and more a source of confirmation bias, fueling the extremism and paranoia that characterized the reign of terror. A prophecy that confirms your existing beliefs is a powerful tool for justifying violence against those who disagree. This period fundamentally altered the perception of Nostradamus's legacy. He was no longer just a 16th century figure, he became timeless. The revolution proved that his work possessed an extraordinary elasticity. It could be stretched to fit any major historical upheaval. The process established during these years would be repeated time and time again. First, the catastrophic event occurs. Second, interpreters scrambled to find a relevant quatrain. Third, the selected quatrain is publicized as proof of inevitability. This pattern removed human agency from history. It suggested that individuals like Robespierre or Louis XVI were merely actors playing out roles written centuries ago. This fatalistic view was comforting to those overwhelmed by the pace of change, but it also absolved individuals of responsibility for their actions. If terror was foretold, it was necessary. If the king's death was foretold, it was just. The chaos of the revolution eventually subsided, giving way to military order. The figure who emerged from the ashes of the Republic was a brilliant, ambitious general who possessed an unparalleled understanding of power and myth, Napoleon Bonaparte. He recognized the utility of propaganda in forging a new empire. While he himself was a man of the Enlightenment, deeply skeptical of superstition, he also understood that the French people, having lived through a decade of trauma, craved a narrative of destiny. Nostradamus, having just proven his accuracy during the revolution, was perfectly positioned to provide that narrative for the new emperor. The prophet's legacy was about to be co-opted once more, shifting from a tool of revolution to a pillar supporting imperial ambition. The focus shifted from quatrains about beheaded kings to verses predicting the rise of a man from humble beginnings who would conquer Europe. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte presented interpreters of Nostradamus with a figure of unprecedented scale. Here was a man who emerged from relative obscurity on the island of Corsica, seized control of France, and then redrew the map of Europe. His meteoric trajectory seemed to defy rational explanation, making it fertile ground for prophetic attribution. Propagandists loyal to Napoleon and independent admirers seeking to curry favor eagerly scanned the centuries for verses that could legitimize his rule. They found compelling candidates, quatrains speaking of an emperor born near Italy, a shaven-headed leader, referencing his short military haircut, distinct from the powdered wigs of the old regime, and a figure who would bring vast armies across the Alps resonated deeply. These interpretations transformed Napoleon from a mere usurper, a product of revolutionary chance, into a man of destiny, foreordained by France's greatest seer. This narrative was incredibly valuable. It suggested that opposing Napoleon was tantamount to opposing fate itself. Napoleon himself maintained a complicated and cynical relationship with mysticism. As a product of the Enlightenment and a military pragmatist, he privately expressed disdain for fortune-tellers and astrology. He understood strategy, logistics, and political science. He did not rely on omens to plan his campaigns. However, he was also a master of public relations and understood the power of myth in state-building. He knew that while the intellectual elite of Paris might scoff, the common soldier and the average citizen were susceptible to tales of destiny. Therefore, he allowed, and perhaps quietly encouraged, the circulation of pro-Napoleonic interpretations of Nostradamus. It cost him nothing and added a layer of supernatural legitimacy to his imperial authority. He cultivated an image of being guided by his star, a more classical Roman concept of destiny that blended well with the resurrected prophecies of Nostradamus. The ancient seer and the modern emperor formed an unspoken alliance where myth bolstered power and power amplified myth. As Napoleon's empire expanded, so too did the application of Nostradamus's verses. His victories at Austerlitz and Jena were seen by supporters as fulfillments of prophecies detailing great triumphs. However, the double-edged sword of Nostradamus's ambiguity began to turn against the emperor as his fortunes shifted. When Napoleon launched his catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812, his enemies found their own ammunition within the centuries. Verses describing vast armies perishing from cold and hunger, a great host retreating from the east, and an empire collapsing from overreach were now highlighted by British, Russian, and Prussian propagandists. The Great Fire of Moscow, which forced the Grand Army into its devastating retreat, was viewed as a literal fulfillment of apocalyptic fire prophecies. The prophet who had once legitimized Napoleon's rise was now being used to narrate his downfall. This demonstrates the ultimate unreliability of prophecy as a political tool. It will always eventually turn against its beneficiary because failure, like success, finds its echo in ambiguous text. The fall of Napoleon did not discredit Nostradamus, it enhanced his reputation. The fact that interpreters found verses matching both his rise and his fall only proved, in the eyes of believers, that Nostradamus had foreseen the entire arc of the Napoleonic saga. He had provided the script for both the triumph and the tragedy. This solidified a pattern where Nostradamus was increasingly associated with great, transformative historical figures. The legend adapted, proving its ability to absorb even the most monumental modern events. The transition from revolutionary chaos to imperial order and back to chaos again showed that the centuries could serve any master and any narrative. The text itself possessed no inherent loyalty. It was a pure reflection of the victor's claims and the vanquished's justifications. This adaptability ensured that Nostradamus would not fade with the 19th century. As technology advanced and warfare evolved, his legacy would be called upon to explain even greater horrors. The next major European conflict would see prophecy industrialized, moving from pamphlets to mass media, and from the hands of amateur interpreters to the calculated machinery of state intelligence agencies. The manipulation reached its zenith during the rise of the Third Reich. While Napoleon's era treated prophecy as a supplemental tool of influence, Nazi Germany integrated it directly into its state propaganda apparatus, recognizing its power to manipulate mass psychology on an industrial scale. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, was a cynical modernist who despised occultism, yet he possessed a keen understanding of public irrationality. He recognized that in times of war and uncertainty, populations become highly susceptible to superstition. Goebbels believed that if the German people could be convinced that their victory was preordained by an ancient, non-German source, their morale would be unbreakable. Nostradamus, with his established reputation across Europe, was the perfect vehicle. Goebbels' ministry established a special division dedicated to finding, reinterpreting, and even fabricating quatrains to support the Nazi worldview. Their greatest discovery was a verse containing the word Hister. The word Hester appears in several quatrains, often in connection with conflicts near the Danube River, the classical Latin name for the lower Danube being Ister. Nazi propagandists seized upon the phonetic similarity between Hister and Hitler. They aggressively promoted the idea that Nostradamus had, nearly 400 years prior, explicitly named the Führer as the destined savior of Germany and conqueror of Europe. Quatrains mentioning Hister alongside battles and great alliances were twisted to represent Hitler's campaigns. These interpretations were not confined to Germany. A key strategic objective for Goebbels was to undermine morale in Allied nations, particularly France. Thousands of leaflets containing pro-Nazi interpretations of Nostradamus were printed. During the Phony War and the subsequent invasion of France in 1940, these leaflets were dropped by air over French towns and villages. They carried messages suggesting that Nostradamus had predicted France's inevitable defeat at the hands of Heister, framing resistance as futile. The psychological impact on a population already fearful of German military might was significant, contributing to defeatism and panic. The British intelligence community quickly recognized the effectiveness of Goebbels' psychological warfare. To counter the Nazi propaganda machine, British intelligence decided to fight fire with fire. They initiated a remarkable black propaganda campaign, turning Nostradamus into an Allied agent. The political warfare executive hired German-speaking journalists, academics, and even occultists to create fake Nostradamus quatrains. These meticulously crafted forgeries mimicked Nostradamus's cryptic style, but contained prophecies predicting the downfall of the Third Reich, specific defeats for German forces, and the eventual suicide of Hitler. These fake prophecies were printed on leaflets designed to look exactly like those produced by Goebbels. They were dropped over occupied Europe and Germany, intended to sow doubt among German soldiers and civilians, suggesting that their great seer actually foretold their doom. This bizarre duel of prophecies meant that Nostradamus was simultaneously predicting victory for both sides of the conflict, with both sides investing significant state resources into a 16th century mystic's ambiguous verses. This episode highlights the sinister potential of prophecy when combined with modern communication technology. In previous centuries, interpretations spread slowly through word of mouth and expensive print runs. In the 20th century, radio broadcasts and mass aerial leaflet drops could deliver tailored propaganda to millions instantly. The Nostradamus myth was weaponized to become an instrument of state policy designed to demoralize entire nations. The story of Hister is perhaps the most compelling evidence against genuine precognition. Nostradamus likely referred to a geographical location, the Ister River. The interpretation of it as Hitler is a classic example of apophenia, finding meaning in coincidence, exploited for political gain. The fact that highly sophisticated intelligence agencies in both Berlin and London dedicated time and resources to this war of prophecies demonstrates a profound, almost cynical understanding that human belief systems are highly vulnerable during times of extreme crisis. When World War II ended, the immediate threat of Nazi domination receded, but humanity entered a new, perhaps even more terrifying era of existential fear. The world was now divided into two superpower blocks armed with weapons capable of instantaneous global annihilation. The anxieties of the Cold War, nuclear holocaust, insidious infiltration, and the potential for sudden, world-ending conflict required new interpretations of Nostradamus. The legend, having survived kings, revolutions, and dictators, proved perfectly adaptable to the atomic age. The Great Fire from the Sky, described in the quatrains, once interpreted as incendiary bombs over London or Dresden, found a terrifying new relevance in the mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fear of Hister was replaced by the fear of Armageddon itself. How do you view the use of prophecy in warfare? Is it a harmless morale booster or a dangerous manipulation of public fear? Let us know what you think. Choose tactic if you see it as a legitimate psychological tool in conflict, or choose deception if you believe it's an unethical exploitation of superstition. The detonation of atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 irrevocably altered human consciousness. For the first time, humanity possessed the capacity for self-annihilation. This new reality created a fertile ground for apocalyptic interpretations of Nostradamus, verses that spoke of fire from the skies, a great new city destroyed by heavenly fire, and long-lasting radiation poisoning, the air and water lacking, a pestilence so great, were no longer abstract allegories. They read like chilling eyewitness accounts of nuclear warfare. Throughout the Cold War, as tensions between the United States of America and the Soviet Union escalated, Nostradamus became a central figure in popular eschatology. Each major international crisis was filtered through the lens of his centuries. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, in particular, saw millions believe they were living through the final days predicted by the French seer. His prophecies were no longer just about the fall of dynasties, they were about the end of the world. This period marked the commercialization and democratization of the Nostradamus myth. He transitioned from the domain of occult scholars and state propagandists to a staple of mass-market paperbacks and tabloid newspapers. The post-war boom in publishing created a hungry audience for sensationalism and conspiracy theories. Books promising to unlock the final secrets of Nostradamus became international bestsellers, each offering a slightly different interpretation of current events and future catastrophes. Authors like Erica Cheetham and Jean-Charles de Fontbrun achieved celebrity status by connecting quatrains to contemporary figures and events. Nostradamus became less a historical figure and more a brand name synonymous with disaster prediction. This commercialization further detached the prophecies from their original 16th century context, making them infinitely malleable. Every earthquake, assassination, or military conflict immediately triggered a race among tabloids to find the corresponding quatrain. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas in 1963 serves as a prime example of this phenomenon. In the wake of the national trauma, interpreters quickly pointed to quatrains mentioning a great man struck down by day by a hidden hand, or vague references to conflicts involving powerful figures. The ambiguity allowed for multiple interpretations. Was the assassin acting alone, or was it a conspiracy foretold in the verses? Believers argued that Nostradamus had pinpointed the tragedy, offering a sense of cosmic significance to a seemingly senseless act of violence. Skeptics pointed out that predictions about the death of great leaders are statistically safe bets in any large collection of prophecies, and that none of the quatrains mention Kennedy, Dallas, or firearms specifically. Yet in the culture of paranoia and grief that followed the assassination, the appeal of a prophetic explanation was powerful. It offered a narrative of order, suggesting that even this shocking event was part of a larger preordained plan. The shift into mass media also meant that Nostradamus became entangled with entirely new sets of predictions and cultural anxieties. His name was invoked in discussions of environmental catastrophe, technological disasters like the Chernobyl meltdown, and even space exploration. The quatrains proved just as adaptable to fears of climate change as they had been to fears of nuclear war. The legend's survival depended on this constant adaptation. If a predicted event failed to materialize, such as the widely publicized interpretation that a great king of terror would descend in July 1999, it was quickly forgotten or reinterpreted by followers. The mechanism of belief relies heavily on selective memory. The dozens of failed predictions are ignored in favor of the one or two seemingly accurate hits. This process ensures the prophet's infallibility in the eyes of the faithful. The very medium of mass communication designed to spread information became the most effective vector for spreading compelling misinformation. As the 20th century drew to a close, the interpretation of Nostradamus entered a new phase, driven by the digital revolution. The rise of the internet created forums where enthusiasts from around the world could collaborate instantly, comparing interpretations and generating new theories at unprecedented speed. This digital environment also provided powerful new tools for analysis, leading to a clash between those seeking to scientifically validate the prophecies and those seeking to scientifically debunk them once and for all. The battle for Nostradamus' soul moved from the printing press to the processor. A new generation of code breakers emerged, convinced that the true message of the centuries was not in the surface text, but hidden beneath layers of complex encryption, waiting for modern technology to unlock it. The age of algorithms promised either ultimate proof or final refutation. The dawn of the digital age brought with it a new methodology for plumbing the depths of cryptic texts, computational analysis. Inspired by similar trends in Bible code research, enthusiasts began applying computer algorithms to Nostradamus' centuries in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The premise was that the true prophecies were not in the plain French text, but were hidden in equidistant letter sequences or complex anagrams that Nostradamus, supposedly a master cryptographer, had embedded within the verses. These researchers claimed to find astonishingly specific predictions for modern events, including references to specific technologies and contemporary political figures that were seemingly impossible for a 16th century author to know. The computer, seen as an objective tool of logic, lent a new veneer of scientific legitimacy to the search for hidden meanings. However, this approach suffered from the same fundamental flaw as traditional interpretation. A vast dataset of text, when subjected to enough permutations, will inevitably produce random correlations that appear meaningful. Critics demonstrated that by applying the same algorithms to texts like Moby Dick, or even a random telephone directory, one could produce equally prophetic results. On the other side of the divide stands the formidable army of scientific skeptics, historians, and linguists who have dedicated considerable effort to methodically dismantling the Nostradamus myth. Figures like James Randi, a professional magician and investigator of paranormal claims, offered substantial rewards for anyone who could prove, under controlled conditions, a single instance of genuine supernatural foresight from Nostradamus. The prize remained unclaimed. Skeptics argue that the entire phenomenon rests on a foundation of cognitive biases and poor scholarship. The primary tool of debunking is linguistic analysis. Scholars emphasize that most accurate predictions rely on poor translations from Nostradamus' archaic French. When read in the original language, With an understanding of 16th century idioms and historical context, the verses often refer to events contemporary to Nostradamus or to vague, generic possibilities. The prophecies about future technology or specific modern events evaporate when the linguistic ambiguity is resolved correctly. The most powerful argument used by skeptics is the concept of post-diction, also known as retrofitting. Nostradamus's predictions are almost never understood before the event occurs. No one in 1938 read a quatrain and warned the world specifically about a German leader named Hitler initiating a world war. No one in 2000 read a verse and predicted a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11, 2001. It is only after the tragedy, when the details are known, that interpreters comb through the centuries to find a verse that can be forced to fit. This process is inherently flawed. The human brain is wired to seek patterns and create narratives to make sense of chaos. Nostradamus provided nearly 1,000 quatrains filled with vague imagery of fire, water, battles, and falling leaders. Statistically, it is inevitable that some of these descriptions will partially match future events. We celebrate the hits and ignore the hundreds of misses, creating an illusion of accuracy. This intellectual duel between believers and skeptics highlights a fundamental tension in human nature: the desire for meaning versus the acceptance of randomness. For believers, Nostradamus offers comfort. He suggests that history is not a chaotic series of accidents, but a structured narrative unfolding according to a divine plan. In this view, even great tragedies have purpose. For skeptics, accepting Nostradamus requires abandoning critical thinking and ignoring overwhelming evidence of psychological manipulation and coincidence. They argue that embracing such myths prevents a clear understanding of history and accountability. If disasters are preordained, there is less incentive to work toward preventing them or holding leaders responsible for their failures. The debate over Nostradamus is therefore more than a historical curiosity. It is a philosophical battle over how we interpret reality itself. The core question remains: if the mechanism of the prophecies is so thoroughly debunked by science and linguistics, why does the legend not only survive, but thrive? The persistence of the myth suggests that its power does not lie in factual accuracy, but in its psychological utility. Nostradamus endures because he fulfills a deep-seated human need for certainty in an uncertain world. The evidence against precognition is overwhelming, yet the allure of the forbidden knowledge he represents remains potent. The very act of debunking can sometimes strengthen the belief system for adherents, who frame skepticism as part of a conspiracy to hide the truth. The legend has become self-sustaining, a cultural virus that adapts to new hosts and new anxieties. The true legacy of Nostradamus, therefore, is not found in the specific predictions, but in the enduring human capacity for belief. The final analysis of his work must move beyond the binary choice of prophet versus fraud and examine the function of the myth itself as a timeless mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears. After 5 centuries of scrutiny, debate, and manipulation, what remains of Michel de Nostradamus? Was he truly a genius who saw the sweep of history, a gifted poet, or merely a brilliant deceiver who capitalized on human fear? The answer, ultimately, may be irrelevant. His true genius was not in foresight, but in insight. He did not need to see the future, he only needed to understand humanity. He recognized that while technologies, borders, and ideologies change, the core drivers of history, ambition, fear, fanaticism, and hope, remain constant. He crafted a body of work so ambiguous, so rich in allegorical potential, that it became a universal receptacle for the anxieties of any era that chose to read it. The centuries are less a map of the future and more a perfect mirror reflecting the present moment of the reader. When 16th century France looked into the mirror, it saw religious wars and unstable monarchies. When revolutionary France looked, it saw the fall of tyranny and the birth of a republic. When the 20th century looked, it saw total war and nuclear annihilation. The enduring power of Nostradamus lies in this very adaptability. His prophecies do not predict events, they absorb them. Each generation reinterprets the quatrains to fit its own traumas, thereby validating the legend anew. The myth survives debunking because it operates on an emotional level, not a rational one. To dismiss Nostradamus as a fraud is to misunderstand the function of myth itself. Myths provide narrative structure to the chaos of existence. They offer comfort by suggesting that events are not random, that there is a larger plan at work. In a world increasingly dominated by data and algorithms, the allure of ancient mystery and hidden destiny only grows stronger. We crave a sense of connection to something larger than ourselves, a feeling that our struggles were seen and acknowledged hundreds of years ago. Nostradamus provides that connection, acting as a timeless confidant for a fearful species. His legacy also serves as a profound cautionary tale about the dangers of interpretation and confirmation bias. History has repeatedly shown that when individuals or nations turn to Nostradamus to justify their actions, the results are often disastrous. The prophecies have been used to fuel paranoia during the French Terror, to legitimize Nazi aggression, and to deepen Cold War anxieties. The quest for certainty in his verses often leads to fatalism, absolving individuals of responsibility for creating a better future. If disaster is inevitable, why try to prevent it? If victory is preordained, why question the methods used to achieve it? The greatest danger of Nostradamus is not that his predictions might be true, but that people act as if they are, thereby shaping reality to fit the imagined prophecy. Today, the anxieties reflected in the mirror have shifted once more. We now search his verses for clues about climate catastrophe, global pandemics, artificial intelligence, and political polarization. New interpretations emerge constantly on social media and internet forums, ensuring that Nostradamus remains relevant in the digital age. The cycle continues precisely as he designed it. His understanding of human psychology, combined with his masterful linguistic ambiguity, created a text that is truly immortal. He built a labyrinth from which meaning can never definitively escape, ensuring that every seeker finds exactly what they are looking for. He proved that a prophecy doesn't need to come true to be powerful, it only needs to be believed. Ultimately, the question of whether Nostradamus was a genius, seer, or a deceiver forces us to confront our own relationship with knowledge and uncertainty. To accept him as a prophet requires a leap of faith that defies logic. To dismiss him as a simple fraud ignores the profound cultural impact and psychological ingenuity of his work. Perhaps the most accurate description is that of a master artist who painted a portrait not of the future, but of human fear itself. As long as humanity confronts uncertainty, as long as we grapple with crises that seem beyond our control, we will continue to gaze into the dark mirror of the centuries. We will continue to seek patterns in the static, hope in the ambiguity, and a sense of order in the chaos. The legend of Nostradamus endures not because he saw our future, but because he understood our eternal present.